So it's a great honor to welcome George Will. And when I met Mr. Will, I said to him, it's an honor to meet him in person because when I was a kid, my parents had a weekly subscription to Newsweek magazine, and I would turn to the back of the magazine to read his column first. So it's an honor to meet him in person. I also want to thank Mr. Michael Polikoff, an actor, for being our partners in this wonderful endeavor. And it's my honor to introduce the sponsor of this forum, Mr. Paul Levy.
Thank you, Moshe, and thank you everybody for coming. We're really very, very excited and pleased to be able to welcome all of you here. We're here thanks to the generosity of Rabbi Scheiner, making the space available to all of us. Mr. Will doesn't need any introduction. I want to make one point, and I'm sure he will in some way elaborate on it. Only 19% of American colleges and universities require the teaching of American history. Think about that, 19%. If you want to wonder why people on the university campuses have gone awry, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're talking about. They can't position America in the world. They have no sense of the history of the world. Mideast, Europe, everything we're worried about today. They don't know what's going on. So the challenges facing American education are really deep. They are far deeper, I believe, than what we're reading in the newspapers. That's bad enough, but down the rot is into the foundation. So God willing, things will improve in time, but until the problem is identified, it will not be cured. So I leave that with you. Thank you again for coming. And let me introduce Michael Polikoff, who has been my partner in putting all of this together, without whom it wouldn't happen.
Good evening. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Rabbi Scheiner. As president of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, or ACTA for short, it's my privilege to work with Rabbi Scheiner and Paul and my ACTA colleagues, and to see the Levy Forum flourish at the Palm Beach Synagogue and serve the community as institutions where the intellectual openness that is the heritage of Judaism and of our nation can flourish. Two very brief announcements. Please be sure to take with you the publications on the tables where you entered. I commend to your attention at this time Dr. Will's December 13 essay, Cheering Hamas on Campus, Too Uneducated to Grasp How Grotesque That Is, and the speech that he gave in which he identified the terrible, terrible effect of the 1619 Project. You can find both of those at the back. I also want to share with you that ACTA's Campus Freedom Initiative is now entering its second year with breakthroughs on several campuses and many more battles ahead. A generous funder has put before us a $1 million matching challenge to expand our reach. Please, according to your ability, help us to fulfill our mission by contributing to that fund. So it is now my honor to introduce Dr. George Will. For over 50 years, Dr. Will, whose career began as a university professor, has been an educator for the nation at large with 16 books and over 6,000 newspaper columns that he's published. His Washington Post columns are syndicated in nearly 450 newspapers, and he's appeared frequently as a panelist on ABC's This Week with David Brinkley, then This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and as a panelist on Meet the Press. He is the winner of the Pulitzer Prize, the Bradley Award, the Champion of Liberty Award, and the Ernie Pyle Lifetime Achievement Award. The Wall Street Journal called him perhaps the most powerful journalist in America. I respectfully wish to correct the Wall Street Journal by removing the word perhaps. He is the most powerful journalist in America. His columns unblinkingly engage the triumphs and tragedies of history, politics, and culture. They're characterized by unwavering commitment to truth, imperviousness to partisanship, and reflective of a deep moral conscience and humanity. Please welcome George Will.
Being the most powerful journalist in America is a little bit like being the tallest building in Topeka. I don't want to live in a country with powerful journalists. I'm just guessing, but could I be the only person in this lovely space this evening who is the grandson of a Lutheran minister? It interests me because when I first went to Washington 54 years ago, I fell under the spell of a man I greatly admired, Senator Scoop Jackson of Washington, who was a great friend of the state of Israel. And I began immediately writing in support of Israel because of Scoop, which got me invited to give a talk at a suburban Washington synagogue, in which I said, truthfully, it was the first time I had ever been in a synagogue, which caused a woman to come up afterwards and say, what a terrible thing to hear from a nice Jewish boy like you. I support Israel because Israel is a salient of our values, and our values are the values of the Enlightenment, of which the Jewish people have been disproportionate carriers and advancers. I want to say more about that. I'm going to be a little bit academic tonight as you reveal my shameful secret, which is I'm a former college professor. In 1976, in June, two of my friends squared off to run for senator from New York. One was the incumbent senator, Jim Buckley, Bill's brother, and the other was the man who became my best friend, Senator Pat Moynihan. And the night they both clinched their nominations, Jim Buckley said at his headquarters, I look forward to running against Professor Moynihan, and I'm sure Professor Moynihan will conduct the kind of campaign you'd expect of a Harvard professor. Back at Pat's headquarters, someone said, Pat, Jim was referring to you as Professor Moynihan. Pat drew himself up to his full height and said, the mudslinging has begun. I want to talk in a professorial way to you tonight about the Enlightenment, which I think established individualism and rationality and pluralism and tolerance as the basis of Western civilization. The Enlightenment is the best thing that has ever happened in Western civilization, and the United States as the embodiment of the Enlightenment is the best thing that's happened because of the Enlightenment. But what we are witnessing now in the United States, and especially on campuses where the Enlightenment should be most cherished, is a large-scale aggressive repudiation of the Enlightenment itself. As I say, the Enlightenment asserts four things really. The primacy of the individual as opposed to the caste or the class or the group. The second is the constancy of human nature. Therefore, third, the existence of natural rights, that is, rights that have been proven by history to be essential for the flourishing of people with our natures. And third, that means limited government. The most important word, in a way, the most neglected word in the Declaration of Independence is secure. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and governments are instituted to secure those rights. First come rights, then comes government. And since government exists to protect pre-existing rights, government's writ is necessarily limited. The Enlightenment addressed the constant, perennial political problem, which is that human beings are opinionated and egotistical. They have opinions and they prefer their own. The question is how to get people like this to live together peacefully. The answer is to understand the difference between the moderns and the ancients. The ancients approached politics by saying, let's envision the ideal and pursue it. The moderns, chastened by history, say, let's envision the worst and avoid it. After the 20th century, that seems like a sensible and prudent way to go. The founders of the United States, men and of the Enlightenment, had a simple catechism. What is the worst outcome of politics? Tyranny. To what form of tyranny is democracy prey, tyranny of the majority. Solution: don't have majorities. Don't have, that is, stable and potentially tyrannical majorities. Have a saving multiplicity of factions that would produce unstable majorities that could not be tyrannical. Before James Madison's revolution in political theory, all philosophers, and there weren't that many, who thought democracy was possible and advisable, had agreed that a democracy had to be a small, face-to-face society, a society like Athens that you could walk across in a day, a society like Rousseau's Geneva. This was because the larger the group, factions existed, and factions were thought to be the enemy of good government. Madison said that's exactly wrong. We want to have an extensive republic. Expand the scope, and you will expand the number of different factions, and you will have unstable coalitions of majorities that can't live long enough and be stable enough to be tyrannical. This is why the revolution in democratic theory happened on our continent. It's an interesting fact. The United States Constitution has a guarantee clause. All states are guaranteed a Republican form of government because the founders said, we know the answer to the question of what is the best form of government. But the Constitution, as amended by the First Amendment, also has an establishment clause. There shall be no establishment of religion because the founders said, we don't know the truth about that. And governments that profess to know the truth about that wind up tyrannical. Government is going to stay neutral about the question of man's relationship to God. Now, I should say, I am not a person of faith. I am an amiable, low-voltage atheist. I don't want to convert anybody. I'm married to a ferocious Presbyterian. But I agree with Thomas Jefferson, who said, our civil rights have no dependence on our religion, religious opinions, any more than on our opinions about physics or geometry. One of the first great state papers of our first president, George Washington, was the letter he wrote to the Truro Synagogue congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, where he said, we are not here to tell you that we will tolerate religious pluralism, because toleration indicates a kind of grudging acceptance. Rather, he said, we celebrate the fact that people may do what they want, believe what they want, think what they want, say what they want, write what they want, and we will all flourish. It is one of the great mysteries of modern life to many social scientists that the most modern of all the modern nations, the United States, is also the most religious nation. This confounds what my dear friend Pat Moynihan called the liberal expectancy. The expectation that as societies became more rational and industrial and commercial, they would become more secular. Not so in ours. In fact, the United States has been wonderfully separate about church and state. James Madison said that when the first Congress, of which he was a member, did as its first act, hired a chaplain for the Congress, this was, he said starchily, not with my approbation. Today, in the name of progress, we are being urged to progress up from the founders, up from and away from the Enlightenment. There is a catechism of the enemies of the Enlightenment that say the following: there is no such thing as human nature. Now, this, of course, undermines all of biblical religion by arguing that human nature is a fiction, that human beings are infinitely malleable, that human beings are whatever impress the culture in which they live makes upon them. Once you say that, once you say that human beings are infinitely plastic to the pressure of culture, then capturing the culture and enforcing a progressive understanding of the culture becomes not only possible but necessary, becomes a moral imperative. Therefore, those who would make the culture shape the right kind of person want to control whatever is said and written, whatever is thought and taught. What you wind up is either something very like Cambodia in the 1970s or Harvard in 2024. Censorship becomes literally progressive in these eyes. What they've done is they've taken John Stuart Mill's harm principle in his wonderful essay on liberty and turned it upside down. What Mill said in On Liberty was, the only possible excuse for censoring thought and speech was to protect people from harm. Mill thought no harm could come from free expression. Today, however, the advocates of censorship say people are harmed by something that A, makes them sad or unsafe or angry or depressed, and they are harmed by any free speech that detracts from the culture that will shape people of a proper progressive nature. This is why we have this astonishing phenomenon of young people coming to college, the safest, greenest, most placid places in the world, saying they are frightened. Their first demand is for safe spaces to protect them from being triggered by ideas that they might not like. It's an astonishing thing to see people who are brittle and proud of being brittle. I don't know how this came about. It has something to do, I think, with whatever caused the noun parent to become a verb. We used to be parents, now we parent. And that suggests that there's a science of parenting, and if you do it just right, your children will all turn out wonderfully. No one who's had one or more children believes that nonsense still. Secularism flourished for a while and seemed to be the wave of the future because religious wars had taught the world the danger of religion. Then the 20th century, fascism and communism, murderous ideologies, strictly and proudly secular, taught us that there was much more to fear in the world than religious in politics. What has become dangerous now is that politics has become a religion. It has become the center of life for so many people. It is the source of meaning in life. That is, politics can deliver a kind of salvation. It can pull people up toward something. It's not clear what. But what it also means is then that dissent becomes heresy. We have lost the laconic, live and let will Jeffersonian belief, who famously said to Jefferson, "It bothers me not at all if my neighbor believes in no God or one God or 20 gods. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." This was the origin of the separation between church and state. Now we see in a comprehensive way today in this rebellion against the Enlightenment, against the idea of excellence, the idea that people should be free to rise, the idea that we should dissolve to the extent possible cohorts in which individuals are submerged. The poet Robert Frost once said, "I do not want to live in a homogenized society. I want the cream to rise." The problem is that the rising cream is today denounced as meritocracy. Think of this. We are now witnessing all across America an argument against the recognition of merit. The argument goes that all differences between people are either accidents of birth and therefore deserving no respect, or they are culturally acquired, and if culturally acquired unevenly and unequally, unjust. So whatever disparities exist in society are presumptively inequitable. How a society is going to produce brain surgeons and the kind of scientific energy that a vital economy needs and our national security depends upon, if we are going to stigmatize excellence as an unjust reflection of merit, I do not know. Speaking of Harvard, as I am loath to do, Harvard was a perfectly mediocre university for a very long time, until the 20s and the 30s. It was devoted to the education of New England's Brahmins' spoiled children. It was not a distinguished place. Then, some people came along and said, we're going to change that. We're going to have admission by the what became the SAT, standardized tests. This was to admit Jews in no small measure. Well, it went well for a while, and then they decided that at Harvard that the admissions should change things because the inner city wasn't properly represented. And at a press conference, a Harvard admissions official said, you see, the problem is that the cities are surrounded by a donut. And one impudent Harvard Crimson reporter said, don't you mean surrounded by a bagel? We were off on the identity politics of group admissions and group rights, everything that the Enlightenment has traditionally stood against. Now, we've seen at Harvard, and not just at Harvard, but most dramatically at Harvard, the eruption of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the most, in a millennium of ideologies, it may be the most successful because it is the most durable, the most lasting. It obviously preceded the Dreyfus Affair. It obviously lived after the Holocaust. When these kids come to Harvard from Columbus, Ohio, and Columbus, Georgia, and Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Fort Worth, Texas, and they wind up cheering on Hamas and calling to globalize the Intifada, which means to have open season on Jews worldwide. The question occurs, did they learn this around their dinner tables? I think not. Well, did they learn it in high school? I think to a remarkable extent they're learning it in high school, where they are learning to see the world in binary terms between oppressing groups and the oppressed groups. Thousands of schools are now teaching the New York Times curriculum. The New York Times, having perfected journalism, looking for something else to do, decided to reframe American history with the 1619 Project, which teaches that systemic racism is A, permanent, B, as bad as ever, and C, the defining characteristic of America. So they come from high schools where they're taught to see the world in binary terms, oppressors, and the oppressed, and they get to college where it is spoon-fed to them constantly. They become grievance groups. They become enthusiasts for the identity politics that annihilates what the Enlightenment celebrates, which is the individual. The Rabbi said, anti-Semitism results from people fearing Jews as the other. Almost right. Timothy Snyder, a Yale historian, has, I think, understood Hitler better than anyone has. Hitler hated the Jews not because they were the other, because they represented the ethical. Hitler's view of the world, the perfect antithesis of the Enlightenment, was that biological, racial identities are everything, the individual nothing. The Jews insisted that biological and other groups are nothing compared to the individual. Hitler knew that the Jews were the enemy of his biological view of the world. I have seen consequences of this up close. When it was suggested that there be a National Holocaust Museum adjacent to the mall in Washington. A lot of Americans, not from any animosity, were puzzled. They said, what has this to do with American history? And I wrote a column that explained what it has to do, and for that reason was invited to go to Poland, to Treblinka, Auschwitz, and Majdanek, and the Warsaw Ghetto, to collect artifacts that became the basis of the museum. My argument was that although the wonderful, clean Euclidean geography of the Washington Mall suggests American history of rationality and purpose, it was good to have the Holocaust Museum adjacent to it to be the dark sun into which Americans and everyone else needs to be taught to stare, because the lesson of that museum is anything is possible because nothing is unthinkable. Something we need to be taught again and again and again, as we were reminded on October 7th. I had one of my children with me, and we took a helicopter to Treblinka, the sandy soil of northern Poland. We got off the helicopter, and my son, who was 13 at the time, said, "Dad, that's a bone." I said, "Jeff, get control of yourself." Our Polish guide said, "That's either a child's rib or a man's finger." The soil, the restless soil of northern Poland, continues to tell the story of the enemies of the Enlightenment and of the Jewish people as the exemplars of the Enlightenment. The Holocaust Museum asserts that the Jews who have had a uniquely hazardous history deserve a common future, which is what Israel is about. I said I was the only son of a Lutheran minister, grandson of a Lutheran minister in the room. I may be the only Goldwater voter in the room tonight. Harry Golden, the great wit from North Carolina, said when Barry was nominated for president, he said, "I always knew the first Jewish president would be an Episcopalian." Well, I think what I've tried to tell you in short compass, to recapitulate, is that the United States is the Enlightenment embodied, as long as it's true to its meritocratic, individualistic, tolerant self. What we are witnessing today, what some of us spent a lot of time resisting, is the overthrow of the Enlightenment, the reestablishment of groupthink, group categories, the submergence of the individual. We can't let it happen. The Council of Alumni is on the front lines of this, and I'm delighted that so many of you came out tonight to hear my complaint about this and to understand the stakes of what is being argued about on American campuses today. It has been shocking, but shocks can wake us up. Thomas Jefferson spoke of hearing a fire bell in the night. The fire bell is ringing loudly now, and we will all thrive with or fail with America's commitment to the Enlightenment, of which the principal beneficiaries, when it came to Europe in the 18th century, led to the emancipation of European Jews. Let's not lose the fight now. Thank you very much.